I'm here with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. Today is Saturday, April 11th. Liz, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to speak with me today.
Happy to do so, Carie.
So Liz, could you tell us where you are now and how the recent events surrounding the COVID-19 virus have changed the structure of your life and your work?
Like many fortunate people who are not on the front lines of this ongoing event, I'm lucky to be at home with two friends, my husband and someone who's been living in our granny flat for several months because he couldn't go back to New York, and a dog. And from this location, I am teaching at the University of Miami and also carrying on projects at DPZ Co-Design. And I'm also the local IT expert.
And so how have you found the transition, at least with regards to maybe online teaching? I know we're only about a week or two into it, but do you have some initial impressions about what that's been like?
Yeah, I think it's been very interesting. I'm teaching both an undergraduate studio and a mixed level seminar on adaptation to climate change. So, of course, part of the discussion in the adaptation seminar is that part of adaptation is planning ahead, is understanding what one needs to prepare for and what accommodations might need to be made should the unhoped for happen. So it's very much related. It's a very much related topic. But the studio I have found very interesting because the one-on-one, we do gather, 12 faces on the screen at one time to talk about overall issues in the studio. And then there are individual sessions. I give half an hour to students, 6 one day and 6 the next. And I find that there's somehow a much more personal connection, not when we're not in the studio surrounded by people, by the other students. It's a lot more fun to be in the studio. You hear students talking about other things, but it can also be, I suppose, distracting. And there's an interesting privacy component in which I feel as if they feel much freer talking about their project individually. I don't really know if this is true or not, but I feel like there's been a lot of information getting across to them. Of course, it all takes much more time on my part. For the studio, for instance, not being able to just pull out the books that I have in the studio and carry them over to the next desk, I've had to put some PowerPoint presentations of precedents and samples of work for them to see. And that also is interesting because it becomes very focused. It takes a lot of time to prepare it, but they're doing housing for the first time in their design careers. And I was surprised how hopeless on floor plans young people can be. I was always looking at floor plans when I was a teenager. But I gathered 10 slides very specifically of very carefully selected housing floor plans of the type that one might expect in American society today, just to give them the kind of ability to learn from those on their own, always thinking ahead of the portfolio for job hunting and so on. So that's been a very interesting aspect of this change.
Yeah, somehow you've had to script it, I guess, more carefully for them because now we don't have all the means to go out and hunt for that information on our own. So yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly.
And in terms of the practice, is that more, has that been less of a transition? Because I assume a lot of your work before this also took place by way of digital or virtual platforms? Or for example, I know that your office relies a lot on charrettes. So
Yeah.
has this somehow influenced the way that you're doing that work, or has it stopped it, or?
No, we've been talking a lot about how we're going to do them, because we're fortunate to have a few projects that are starting up and have not interrupted the startups. So it's going to be very different. Well, first of all, there's a group of people in the office who have been accustomed to working across the 3 different offices we have. We actually have people in 4 different locations. And no surprise, the younger folk are quite used to doing everything on the screen. All their graphics, all their communication, no problem. There is a certain issue, which is that it needs to be more hierarchical, that there needs to be somebody saying, I'm the boss and this is what I'm asking you to do. The kinds of design discussions that you have working together or on charrette are somewhat limited. I must say, we haven't tried an all-day Zoom session, which I think would probably drive everybody over the edge. But what we're anticipating is that we will probably space out the kinds of meetings of a charrette normally over more time. We'd still like to keep the focus as condensed as possible, because you want everybody's attention to not go to other places. And then people might be working in teams on screens together and then coming back for reviews together. And then, maybe there's the big client review every day or something like that. So it'll still be much of the same process, but the interfaces will probably modify a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I do think, even though maybe the teaching works pretty well, I do think there will be some, maybe not quality loss, but experience loss. And of course, having them, people have been doing virtual charrettes recently for any number of reasons, but that kind of interface with the public that you might have in a municipal project is probably severely compromised.
so Liz, we're really at the beginning of this, and so it's hard to speculate what might happen, but because we've all been sort of confined to our homes for the last, at least in Miami, close to 3 weeks, have you had any thoughts about how this experience, these recent events, might impact the world of architecture or even the future design of cities, if any?
Well, I think there are 2 roads ahead of us. One is that there's a sea change, which people are predicting and saying, we're going to be changed forever and everything will change. And the other one is that at some point we'll get back to normal and we'll have a tendency to forget about what we just went through. But I think our hurricanes experience in South Florida may be a good example of how we move forward, because we are in effect much the same as we were before the various severe hurricanes we've had. But there were changes made. The building code changed after Hurricane Andrew. People are much more prepared. There's more generators around after the last hurricane, any number of things. People have emergency plans. And in fact, I think our probably staying at home these couple of weeks isn't unlike, staying at home without power, except we've been lucky enough to have power now. That happens after hurricanes. So I think we're probably all a bit, and we probably will alter our preparation plans. At a larger scale, though, I think we're looking at, first of all, I think there's a lot of focused media in which there's a lot of news we've been losing because people really have focused on the pandemic. And it's been a kind of armchair focus, it seems like. You know, everyone's grasping for what's the latest news and what's the latest data and what are the scientists saying and so on. But along the way, so I'm a little bit suspicious about it all, but along the way, there has been an acknowledgement that we had some predictions about events like this, and that we really didn't follow through on those with the proper planning. And that certainly is a reflection on our attitude towards adapting to climate change as well. And, you know, we're being told that things are going to happen and that we're going to have to adapt. And we've been slow to plan those adaptations. Also, I think we're understanding that there's a kind of level of region or community at which some of the response plays out. You know, it's difficult for the federal government to figure out what should go under these circumstances. And, you know, trying to push it down to the states, and then the cities are making their own rules about the curfews and so on. And so I think some of that could be thought through in a way that some, I think, more centralized governments have considered. I mean, there are control issues in planning that obviously people worry about in democracies, but it's about setting out the scenarios and acknowledging what level of government can do what. Andres, I don't know if he talked about his concept of subsidiarity, and that there are obviously for any kind of planning, whether it's the physical environment or a national preparedness for problems, especially unpredictable problems, that there are logical levels of engagement. You know, what happens at the top level? What is the bottom level responsible for? And many in-betweens, federal, regional, state, and the various agencies that have to deal with these things. And I think we perhaps have seen that that's not a clear picture, and that maybe it should be clarified. I think back to after Hurricane Andrew, I'm aging myself by referring to that one, but the university put together an emergency preparedness plan that was very thorough. And it was very interesting to participate in that back then. I know it's gone through many generations since then, but anybody who's been through those events understands that having such a plan in place is really a good idea. And they do take time. And from a political perspective, you have to acknowledge that bad things happen, and you have to get over opposing or contradictory or competing ideas. And that's probably something we need to do at many levels. So that's not the physical environment, the built environment, but I must say I've thought about that as well as an urban design teacher. And there's a lot of, there's a certain amount of press about the fact that high density doesn't work. You know, that's the least comfortable place to be right now. And certainly we in our small town environment of Coral Gables have the comfort of being able to walk out onto green streets and enjoy the open air. There's a lot more bicycling going on and walking in our neighborhood than we've ever seen, which leads me to think that making those alternate modes of transportation much more explicit in the built environment. And cities are, a number of cities have shut large amounts of their streets to automobiles, the ciclovia idea, but across a much larger transect of the built environment. acknowledging that way people can walk in the street and keep the distancing, and have more space for pedestrians and bicycles. So I think those kinds of, that could be a long-term effect, that we alter those ways. I mean, imagine if, you know, I don't know if it would work in Manhattan, but if you took one of the wide streets and said, all right, you can come out now on foot and keep at a certain distance, I think people would probably be really pleased to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comparison to the hurricane and the periods that follow is a really interesting one, especially for those of us that live in South Florida.
Yeah.
You point to maybe the possible full breath from the personal response, let's say buying your own generator, to the regulatory responses that might occur as a result of these types of kind of crises. So perhaps, and I think you of course, your career and your work as an architect and as an urbanist has in fact really confronted, I think, the invisible networks of what builds cities. And so perhaps moving forward, architects might find themselves playing a bigger role in that, because it really is those legislative networks that in the end give rise to new forms. So I don't know if for the students that might be watching this, that you might have recommendations as to how they might, you know, go out and maybe think about their future in more ambitious ways as opposed to in fearful ways, which is what times like these can create.
Yeah. So, you know, as a school, we've decided that we wanted to focus on urban resilience as a theme throughout the coursework these years. And that the studio that I'm teaching, of course, the housing studio has a site in the Bahamas. It's a site that was cleared by the Hurricane Dorian. And so we are beginning to touch upon that. What does that mean in terms of architecture? What does resilience mean in terms of architecture? And of course, climate resilience then, in a place that's beset by storms, it has a lot to do with how can you continue surviving when you're off the grid. But of course, the sense of community and the interdependence of community. How can people help each other and not depend on levels of government, if possible, comes into play. And so I think that's, in terms of architecture, that's about how do you make buildings where perhaps people can interact, not focus so much on privacy or individual comfort, but imagine that some kind of way to convene comfortably or to share that space safely. What does that mean in the long run? I think we'll probably all be figuring that out as we go along.
Liz, thank you so much. I'm grateful for being able to connect, albeit virtually. And I hope you and Andres and your guests in the cottage remain safe and well, and look forward to connecting sooner rather than later on
Thank you. Thank you, Carie. You know, if I could add one more thing, today it occurred to me that it could, because of course everybody's asking, how do we go forward? What's going to happen at the university? We are thinking that summer may still be online, but what about the fall? What does that mean in terms of the students enrolling and so on? And I think it could be very interesting to imagine a fall where maybe some people are on campus and others are remote, because we have really ramped up our ability to communicate, transmit, and engage, even with design. Well, 3D fabrication may be the one place that is difficult, but I think we could have a very interesting time of it with some students in place and some students in faraway places, and in the long run, make ourselves much more accessible globally in that way. That could be very interesting. So I look forward to making some lemonade.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a good way to end. Thank you so much, Liz.
You're welcome, Carie.